Make a personal note without undue deference, Mr. Speaker. I thoroughly appreciate your remarks about standards within the chamber. Mr. Speaker, to date, HMRC have not initiated insolvency proceedings against any taxpayer for a loan charge debt. No estimate can be provided for the number of people who have fallen into debt or who have been declared bankrupt and are subject to the loan charge, because where debts arise, HMRC are not always the only creditor. Some individuals are declared bankrupt as a result of a non-HMRC debt, and some may choose to enter insolvency themselves based on their overall financial position.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know there are many, many thousands of nurses, social workers and other public sector workers who have been caught up by the loan charge. They took work via agencies who told them, basically, sign here or you don't get the work. Checking to see if they'd be liable for the loan charge actually wasn't an option. Last week, the Yorkshire Post reported that a number of former services personnel have been affected and one is feeling suicidal as a direct result. So what does the Minister say to this veteran and the thousands of other public servants whose lives have been turned upside down by this retrospective taxation?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Taxation is often a difficult matter for the relatively small number of individuals who may be affected by particular pressures. And of course, the government recognises that and understands it. But it is nevertheless the case, it is indeed a foundational principle of the tax system, that people should be responsible for their own tax returns. And if I may, I'd like to refer the Honourable Lady to the very wise words of the former Shadow Chancellor, who said, we would, in 2018, in relation to the loan charge, we would obviously welcome tightening in the area of disguised remuneration schemes. We are concerned that the measures in this bill do not go far enough. There should be no excuse, these are her words, there should be no excuse for people not to be aware of the situation. I'm afraid she was right about that.
Shadow Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government's approach to the loan charge means that ordinary people who are victims of mis-selling are suffering financial ruin and personal harm. Ministers will have heard some harrowing accounts of people pushed to the very brink and worse, some even tragically taking their own lives. This cannot be what the government envisaged, and a new approach is urgently needed. So will the Treasury now review the loan charge scheme and the approach of HMRC to prevent further devastating consequences?
Well, I thank the Honourable for his question, and of course, as I have said, both the Government and Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs take these cases extremely seriously, and that is why HMRC have put in place extra care and support for people who may be affected by tax issues of this and other kinds. But the fact remains that we have had a review, and I might refer the Honourable Gentleman to the words of his colleague, the member for Ilford North, where he said that of Sir Amias Morse, who did the review, that the review was a thorough piece of work, and we thank him. He has done a great service to Parliament and to the wider public debate. He was right about that, and the Labour Party has been right not to have opposed this policy at any point during its passage in Parliament.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the problem that members have on both sides of this House is that ordinary people were duped into something, and it's effectively become a retrospective legislation. And I thought the way the Shadow Minister approached this was very reasonable. I do think that the way HMRC are approaching this is not the right approach. Perhaps you could look at it, perhaps the government could look at that again.
Well, I thank the friend for his question. I have mentioned the extra care support that HMRC have put in place. I have mentioned the extremely careful approach they've taken with people who may be facing the loan charge. As he will be aware, they have not initiated insolvency proceedings against any taxpayer for a loan charge debt, and that itself is emblematic of the care and attention with which they are taking this subject.
Samuel Wilson.
Okay. It's not enough for the Minister to say that people have to take responsibility for their own tax affairs, when the information that they were given by HMRC was that there was nothing wrong with these schemes initially, when HMRC passed and signed off tax years for people, and when the head of HMRC has admitted that in recent months he had repeatedly tried, this is a Freedom of Information request, and the outcome, in recent months I have repeatedly tried to obtain legal analysis to understand the strength of our claim, with very little success. So there's not even a legal standing for this. How then can the Minister say that it is right to pursue people for things that they were led into, and indeed for payments which HMRC were regularising by allowing contractors to use as a means of paying their employees?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman raised a whole bunch of different questions. Let me just address them. HMRC, there were some contractors working for agencies and through agencies for HMRC, and where it was discovered that they had used disguised remuneration, those relationships were ended, and very strong measures have been put in place to prevent that recurrence. And that's an unfortunate feature of the extended way in which these contractual arrangements sometimes work. I don't think there's any evidence that HMRC have signed off or positively approved the use of any disguised remuneration scheme. And if the Honourable Gentleman has got an example of that, he'd be welcome to send it to me. In relation to the Chief Executive of HMRC, I think he will be aware that the Chief Executive has specifically written to the APPG to clarify, to make perfectly clear that it is taking those remarks out of context, and what he was doing was putting, as every chief executive of a public agency should do, his own officials under some pressure to provide the justification needed, and rightly so.
Owen Thompson.
Question 2. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to answer this question together with questions 5 and 10. HM Treasury analysis published alongside Budget 21 has shown that policy interventions in response to COVID-19 have, on average, supported the poorest working households most as a proportion of pre-pandemic income.
Thompson.
Mr. Speaker, the Government's plan to increase national insurance will clearly unfairly impact the living standards of young people and low-paid. In sharp contrast to the Scottish Government's free education, bus travel for under-25s and the Scottish Child Payment. Can he confirm how many ministers spoke against this move at Cabinet today, and whether this included the Scottish Secretary? Well, you would have thought, having sought additional powers, he would be more interested in reminding the House on how his own government is using the powers they have. And the key issue is, on many areas, whether it's on the taxpayers that acquired, they're choosing not to use them, for example, to top up universal credit. He should focus on the alliance they've formed with the Greens, which is bad for business, bad for the economy, bad for the oil and gas industry, and counterproductive to growth.
Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2016, the Tories promised that fuel bills would be lower for everyone when leaving the EU. The reality is fuel bills are increasing while they're going to do the heartless cut through universal credit. So to tackle fuel poverty, will they use the net zero review to cut VAT and energy efficiency products, keep new nuclear off electricity bills, also to provide direct funding for heat decarbonisation and sort out the unfair grid charges in Scottish renewables?
Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, one should look at what my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has done. I touched on a moment ago on how the COVID measures have protected the poorest working households the most. If you actually look also alongside that at the budget measures on tax, welfare and spending decisions made since 2019, on average they have benefited all households this year, with the poorest gaining the most as a percentage of net income. That is the approach my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has taken. It is one the Scottish Government should follow.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More than 3 million children across the United Kingdom living in low-income households are likely to be affected by the £20 universal credit cut, according to Save the Children, with half of claimants saying that they will face significant financial impacts as a result, with 1 in 7 worrying about affording food. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation said the cut will push 500,000 people below the poverty line. Can the Chancellor explain how this squares up with the government's so-called levelling up agenda?
Well, the key way of tackling poverty is to get people into work and then to skill them up in those jobs. And that is what we have set out through the plan for jobs, and that plan is working. But ultimately, if these are the priorities of the Scottish Government, why are they not using the powers they have to prioritise that?
Mel Stride.
Would my right honourable friend agree with me that it is difficult to justify raising national insurance in order to fund social care for the predominantly elderly, when the impact of that tax rise would fall mainly on young people and those who are earning little in the workforce? And would he also recognise that those two groups are the very groups that have been most economically impacted by the economic consequences of the pandemic?
Well, my right honourable friend will know the Prime Minister will make a statement shortly. But what he and I would agree on is the best way is to grow the economy, to drive productivity and get people into work and to skill them up through work. And that is what the Plan for Jobs is doing, alongside the £600 billion investment over the course of this Parliament in infrastructure as part of levelling up, as part of our commitment to net zero. So we need to grow the economy, skill the workforce, and for those who have been impacted by the pandemic, get them back into work as quickly as possible.
Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the Chief Secretary has had the opportunity to read a recent report by the Institute for Fiscal Studies that says, and I quote, "Material living standards held up surprisingly well through the pandemic. This is an astonishing outcome given the scale of the economic disruption."
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right, and it is through the package of measures that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, took, that the economic scoring that was forecast for the pandemic, including the figure of unemployment, which will now be 2 million lower at its peak than was estimated. It is those measures, those package of measures, that have helped prevent many of the worst outcomes that were forecast by the OBR as we went into the pandemic.
Mr.
Speaker, one group whose living standards have been impacted during the pandemic has been those low-income individuals who have used buy now, pay later credit products to buy online. I very much welcome the government's announcement earlier in the spring of regulation of this sector. Can the Minister update me on the progress being made in regulating this sector, given it is becoming of increasing importance, as we see from Citizens Advice Bureau reports just last week?
Well, I understand by the end of October there will be reassurance on that, and I'm happy to pick that up with him following the session.
Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Chancellor increased universal credit 18 months ago, he said he wanted to look back and remember how we thought first of others and acted with decency. Does the Minister consider that taking £20 a week from millions of families across our country is really an act of decency?
Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, £400 billion of support in response to the COVID pandemic across our public services, individual businesses, shows to the scale of measures that the Chancellor has put in place. But on the specific issue of universal credit, we were always clear that it was going to be temporary. As it is, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, extended it for a further 6 months. But ultimately, what divides the two sides is we believe the best approach is to have a plan for jobs, to get people into work and to upskill them in those jobs. They simply don't have a plan at all.
Lady Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let's think about what £20 a week really means. £20 a week means being able to afford to buy coats for your children this winter. It means not having to worry about turning on the heating when the weather turns cold. Can the Minister offer any advice to families who work hard and play by the rules about how they should manage with £100 less each and every month?
Well, as the honourable lady knows, alongside the universal uplift, there was other measures of support that were given. But I'd actually, rather than my words, I'd quote the Resolution Foundation, who said that since the crisis hit, the support schemes introduced by the government have prevented an unprecedented collapse in GDP from turning into a living standards disaster. That is the package of measures put forward by the government. That is how we have protected people's living standards. But the key is to have a plan, to get that plan working. It is, and that is helping people back into work.
Christopher Cho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend comment upon the living standards of those thousands of public sector employees to whom the government has given exit payments of in excess of £100,000 a year and continues so to do?
Well, my right honourable friend is right to highlight this issue, which he and I have discussed on many occasions. We have I chaired a roundtable in July on this issue across government. It is something that is being prioritised across departments. We have a manifesto commitment which the Chancellor and I are committed to delivering on, and as he knows, there is a £200 million cost to this which we need to tackle. But at the same time, we also need to be true to the manifesto, which was not about tackling those on low incomes who had high payoffs because of the way their pensions benefits are structured and those propriety claims. We need to differentiate between that and what I think is the real ill that he is concerned of, which is those on six-figure salaries who are receiving payoffs, and that is something we are prioritising.
Actually, was that related to the original question? So we're going to have to watch out for that in the future. Can I come to SNP spokesperson Alison Thewlis?
Mr. Speaker, Scottish hospitality and generosity is world renowned, but could he explain to us why he thinks that Scottish taxpayers should pay for England's social care crisis?
It's a slightly odd question because actually through the broad shoulders of the United Kingdom, it is Scottish jobs that have been protected through the furlough. It is Scottish businesses that have been supported through the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme. It is the block grant that has provided additional funding to the Scottish Government. And the oddity is that they are choosing not to use those uplifts in the Scottish grant to prioritise the things they come down to Westminster and say they care about.
Can I just suggest the Minister might be easier if he goes through the chair? Alison Thewlis.
As well, now the Prime Minister's hike in national insurance has been roundly panned, not least by his own backbenchers and by the chair of the Treasury Select Committee. People in Scotland are already feeling the pain of a decade of Tory austerity cuts, the harms caused by Brexit, with the devastation of the £20 a week cut to universal credit still to come, none of which, Mr. Speaker, they voted for. So why should my constituents pay for him to break his manifesto pledge and a new poll tax on the poorest who can least afford it?
Well, it may be helpful, Mr. Speaker, to just remind the House of the uplifting funding that the Scottish Government have received as a result of the ability of the UK Government to act across the UK. Baseline funding of £28 billion last year, with an additional £8.6 billion of funding, £36.6 billion in total. That has increased to £40.9 billion this year. So the Scottish Government is getting additional funding. As a result of COVID, they have received, Mr. Speaker, an additional £14.5 billion, but they are choosing not to prioritise that extra money or use the additional powers they have on tax or welfare to target the issues they say they care about.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the beginning of this pandemic, like most people, I was really worried that unemployment would rise by millions, and I'm delighted that actually it's peaked 2 million below what most people forecast, and that unemployment at 4.7% is actually now at historic lows. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the best way to raise living standards is to get those without jobs into jobs, and for those who already have jobs, give them the training and skills they need so they can get higher paid jobs? And that's exactly what the government's doing.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much agree with my honourable friend. And it's as a result of those measures that unemployment has now fallen for 6 months in a row, that the OBR are forecasting a peak of 5 to 6% compared to the previous 12%. And as he quite rightly says, that the peak will be 2 million fewer. But it's not just those who are being helped back into work. It is also the programme of apprenticeships, of traineeships, of job support, of the doubling of work coaches that then will help people in work get into the better jobs that they deserve.
Question number 3.
Minister.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I should like to answer this question together with questions number 6, 8, 9 and 13. The Prime Minister's 10-point plan demonstrates our commitment to net zero. It sets out £12 billion of new government investment in green industries. This will create and support up to 250,000 highly skilled green jobs in the UK. In addition to this £12 billion, our plan will attract up to 3 times as much private investment by providing regulatory certainty and robust green finance frameworks.
The recent Climate Change Committee progress report showed that the Treasury had not fully met a single one of its recommendations in the last year. Does the Minister think this is good enough, and what steps should be taken to rectify this?
Minister.
I'm afraid I don't think that is what the report has said. What I will say is that there are many publications which we are going to be releasing this autumn around net zero, not least the Net Zero Review, and this final report will be published in advance of COP26. The report will inform sectoral decarbonisation strategies and the net zero strategy, and work on these will continue to develop at pace across Whitehall.
Mr. Speaker, the recent cuts to the international aid budget have undermined the UK's leadership in advance of COP26. So what urgent steps will the Treasury take to develop a carbon-neutral programme of international aid going forward?
Minister.
I will ask my counterparts in the FCDO to answer her question directly. They are responsible for aid. But what I will tell her is that there is a lot of stuff that we're doing within our remit on international climate finance action, not least on the task force on nature-related climate financial disclosures.
Virginia Crosby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Time and again, I speak with companies who want a free port on Anglesey. I want a free port on Anglesey, and local people want the jobs and local investment that will come with the free port. But the Welsh Government say and do nothing. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister please urge the Welsh Government to work with me to deliver this game changer in my constituency of Ynys Moor?
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my honourable friend for her letters and continued campaigning for her constituency. We are working with the Welsh Government closely and remain committed to establishing at least one free port in Wales as soon as possible, and I would encourage them to work closely with constituency MPs on this. As in England, specific locations will be chosen in a fair, open and transparent allocation process.
Jeff Smith.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. The Minister must recognise that the climate inaction is not just a disaster for the planet, it has a huge financial cost and economic consequences. We can't dodge the critical decisions anymore that we need to decarbonise the economy. So how exactly will the government hardwire our net zero targets into every decision in the upcoming spending review?
Minister.
What I would say to the honourable gentleman is that we have used the Green Book to mandate that policies must be developed and assessed against how well they deliver on the government's long-term policy aims, including net zero. We did this in Spending Review 2020. Guidance required departments to include the greenhouse gas emissions of bids and their impact on meeting carbon budgets and net zero. And allocations to departments were informed by this information, and this is how we will continue to carry out climate impacts in terms of fiscal policy.
Julie Moss.
Thank you. I thank the Minister for her response. With over £10 trillion worth of assets under management in the UK, there is more scope for more green innovation investment to go into via the venture capital sector. So I welcome the measures she's explained and the regulatory changes being driven by the Treasury. But I asked whether she'd meet with me to discuss a potential office for venture, similar to the new Office for Investment, which could provide a centre for expertise and growth in this area.
I thank the honourable lady, my honourable friend, for that question. The government recognises the important role of financial markets in supporting the UK's transition to a net zero economy. The British Business Bank is a government-owned economic development bank that makes finance markets for smaller businesses work more effectively, and their remit does include venture capital. But I note her point about a meeting, and I believe that my honourable friend, the Economic Secretary, will be very happy to meet her on this issue.
Shadow Minister Abena Pongasari.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's only 55 days until COP26 in Glasgow. Households, consumers and businesses urgently need clarity and certainty about how the costs and benefits of our transition to net zero will be shared. Labour's approach to tackling the climate crisis would have fairness at its heart, because we know that while some are planning to build personal heated swimming pools in their homes, millions of others are struggling with energy bills. The Net Zero Review is supposed to consider the issue of fairness. At the last Treasury questions, the Chancellor told my honourable friend for Leeds West that the final report would, and I quote, of course be published imminently. That was 11 weeks ago. Where is it?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I said in answer to a previous question, the report will be published in advance of COP26. But we have published other things that she doesn't seem to have heard of or have read. We have set out ambitious plans about net zero target. We've published the energy white paper, the industrial decarbonisation strategy, the transport decarbonisation plan, something that has not happened anywhere in the world. We are the first country in the world to do a transport decarbonisation plan and a hydrogen strategy, and we will publish the heat and building strategy in due course. This government has been very busy setting out plans on net zero. We would appreciate it if the opposition parties actually took some time to read them.
The government's measures will have important consequences for taxpayers and also on energy bills. Can I ask my honourable friend to therefore set out in detail the cost of net zero and also the calculations behind that cost?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. We will put affordability and fairness at the heart of our reforms to reach net zero. And our latest estimates put the costs of net zero at under 2% of GDP, so broadly similar to when we legislated for it 2 years ago, with scope for costs of low-carbon technologies to fall faster than expected. Most of these represent increased investment in growth markets of the future. But I take his point, and all I would say is that he should wait until the net zero review is published.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the previous honourable gentleman and I may not have the same particular views on this, but we both share a concern about how the government will fund net zero, given that we're going to see the reduction in petrol vehicles, for example, and yet what's going to happen to the tax on that? We've seen yet another failure with the Green Homes Grant recently. So what is the fiscal plan for making sure that net zero achieves its targets while we maintain the exchequer balances?
Minister.
I thank the right honourable lady for that question. We recognise that this is an issue that is under intense speculation. We will publish a strategy that will set out many of the answers to the questions which she is posing. What we have said is that we will put affordability and fairness at the heart of our reforms to reach net zero. The fact is, everyone in this House agreed with us when we set that target. We know, for example, that we have put in place plans to bring in electric vehicles by 2030. These will require different changes in how not just we spend, but our tax and regulatory system, and the answers will come in due course.
As Chair of the Hydrogen APPG, can I take this opportunity to welcome the Government's world-leading comprehensive hydrogen strategy, backed up by £105 million of public funding to unlock £4 billion of private investment by 2030. Does she agree with me that this is how we'll build back better and create more jobs in places like Teesside?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I do agree with him. Building back better and building back greener is at the heart of this government strategy. And I thank him for raising the points which he has, which will benefit Teesside and the North East in general.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the weekend, a young activist called Fatima challenged the Chancellor, asking why the Treasury is blocking action on the climate crisis. He replied that the Treasury had committed to 12 billion of new money to the 10-point plan. But even that's not true, as he knows, and the President of COP26 has said actually only a paltry 4 billion is new money. So when will the Treasury start committing serious money to the green transition in the region of the 85 billion that the TUC has said is necessary to put into green investment so we go into COP26 as climate leaders, not climate laggards?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I will tell the honourable lady what the Treasury is doing. We are issuing £15 billion of green bonds over the next year and launching a world-first green savings bond ahead of COP26 to help finance the government's green project. We set up the UK Infrastructure Bank to invest in net zero, backed by £12 billion of capital, which will also help to unlock more than £40 billion of overall investment in infrastructure. We're committing £11.6 billion in international climate finance over the next 5 years to help developing countries tackle climate change. The budget also announced 3 UK-wide competitions, which are part of the £1 billion net zero innovation portfolio. We have the Towns deal, which is helping people create new green spaces, build back greener, create sustainable transport routes, or repurpose empty shops. The fact is, the Treasury is doing everything it can to support the transition to net zero.
Come on.
Number 4, Mr. Speaker.
Minister, Chancellor.
with permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer this question with question number 19. It is absolutely right that we remain relentlessly focused on helping young people into work, and our plan for jobs does exactly that with a range of initiatives. And I would just draw colleagues' attention to the fantastic youth offer that our job centres are rolling out, providing 13 weeks of intensive tailored support to those young people who enter universal credit, and creating 140 dedicated youth hubs across the country.
James Daly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Bury, Ramsbottom and Tottington, the government's plans for jobs is working, saving jobs and getting people back into employment. But as chair of the APPG for youth employment, can my right honourable friend update the House specifically on how schemes such as Kickstart are helping young people with employment and training opportunities throughout the country?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for all the work he does as chair of the Youth Employment APPG, and I thank him and his colleagues for their advice as we have developed these initiatives. He's right to highlight Kickstart. This is a signature initiative of this government, providing government-funded, high-quality jobs for young people at risk of long-term unemployment. It's got off to a fantastic start, Mr. Speaker, with 50,000 Kickstarters already having started and thousands more to come.
Albert Carney.
Thank you, Speaker. That initial response is helpful, and of course I commend the Chancellor and his Treasury colleagues for their financial support to some businesses over the last 18 months. And I realise important announcements from the Treasury and the Prime Minister are imminent. However, in a city such as Lincoln, with such a vibrant hospitality sector, the cumulative impact of successive lockdowns has hit my constituents hard, especially young people. And my right honourable friend knows they are disproportionately employed in those businesses which are forced to close. Does the Chancellor agree that we must do everything possible to keep the economy open, so that instead of paying young people not to work, we focus on creating well-paid jobs for them?
Chancellor.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight the importance of hospitality to employing young people, which is why, together with our VAT cut for that sector and indeed £16 billion of business rates reductions, we've helped support all those jobs. He should also know that actually employers do not pay employers' national insurance on those young people under the age of 21, nor on most apprentices up to the age of 25, demonstrating our support to those employers to keep young people in work.
Very Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, when I was a very young MP, a Conservative Prime Minister introduced a windfall profit tax on the banks. When will this administration and this Chancellor of the Exchequer have the imagination and the leadership to introduce a windfall profit tax on those who have done very well over the last few years and put it into green apprenticeships, green training and green skills, and to do it now?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that the honourable gentleman talking about young people and financial services. I recently was actually in Glasgow talking about young people starting exactly what he described. New apprenticeships in the financial services industry, glowing in Glasgow, supported by this government, who have put more money behind apprenticeships than any government previously.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm hearing from colleges that fewer Level 1 and Level 2 students are going to college because, in fact, they're going straight to work, and that's to be commended. But we do know that having a Level 3 increases your earning potential in the long term, and those opportunities to obtain that Level 3, therefore, must be available to these young people as they get older. So how can those young people achieve this when the Chancellor of the Exchequer has cut the adult skills budget by half since 2010.
Chancellor. Mr. Speaker, I point the honourable lady to the Prime Minister's speech last year on skills, where he unveiled this government's lifetime skills guarantee, which delivers exactly what she is asking for. So those 10 million adults, which he is absolutely right to highlight, without a Level 3 qualification, will for the first time be able to get one fully funded by this government. That is the Conservative government delivering for people, giving them the skills and the opportunities they need.
Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it seems to me that the combination of the furlough scheme, the Kickstart scheme, the youth offer that he's just discussed, show that the Chancellor's efforts are leading to the UK having one of the fastest economic recoveries in the world. Will he commit to working globally to ensure that the confidence and opportunities that this brings are available globally as they are increasingly here in the UK.
Chancellor. Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right, and can I thank him for two things, Mr. Speaker. First of all, when he was a minister, he created traineeships, which he will be pleased to know that this government is tripling the number of, to give young people the best possible start in life to find new skills and opportunities. But most importantly this year, Mr. Speaker, because of his success in making sure that this country had the fastest rollout of a vaccine anywhere in the world, we are enjoying the fastest opening up and the fastest economic recovery, and I pay tribute to him for that.
David Linden.
Mr. Speaker, the government announced the Kickstart scheme to much fanfare, and at the moment it publishes a breakdown of statistics of Kickstarters by gender and perhaps by race. Why doesn't it do so for disability, and will the Chancellor rectify that?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, I'm always happy to look at what more we can do to improve the transparency of our statistics, but with regard to Kickstart in aggregate, I would just say at 50,000 starts, compared to previous versions of similar schemes like the Future Jobs Fund under the last Labour government, Kickstart is delivering more young people into more jobs at a much faster pace, and importantly, many more in the private sector, not just the public sector.
Rob Butler.
Number 7, please, Mr. Speaker.
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has rightly wanted to usher in and... Oh, sorry, yes, Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'd like to answer this question together with question number 11. The Prime Minister is rightly ushering in an infrastructure revolution because infrastructure drives growth, it drives productivity and it creates jobs. We are doing that with over £100 billion of investment this year and, thanks to the efforts of the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, a world-leading UK infrastructure bank created, set up in Leeds.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that all parts of the country can benefit from investment in infrastructure, and that an excellent way of achieving that in my own constituency of Aylesbury and supporting the very substantial housing development there would be to approve funding for the Aylesbury link of East West Rail, which would also help to achieve our target of net zero?
Chancellor.
I commend my honourable friend. He's absolutely right to focus on making sure our investment reaches every part of the country, including in his constituency. I'm pleased to tell him that £760 million has been allocated by the Chief Secretary and the Transport Secretary to deliver East West Rail, and I understand that the Department for Transport are currently working with the East West Rail Company to figure out the best possible way to serve Aylesbury, and I hope that he will engage with that process.
Ruth Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Infrastructure Forum recently published a report which showed clearly that the super deduction is already having an impact, accelerating investment by businesses. Will my right honourable friend join me in encouraging businesses across Grantham and Stamford to take up the relief? And does he agree that this is exactly the kind of investment that will boost jobs and level up our country?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, from the OBR to the Bank of England, many people have described the super deduction as doing exactly what he has said, and that's why we know it is working. I've recently visited BT, for example, Mr. Speaker, that because of the super deduction are now increasing the speed of their rollout to millions more houses and creating thousands of new jobs in the process. So he's absolutely right. I encourage his businesses to take it up, and indeed we see that, Mr. Speaker. The survey from Deloitte recently showed that business intentions to invest in this country are at the highest they have been in years.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid to tell the Chancellor that his infrastructure revolution is not very noticeable on cities in the north of England which grind to a halt at rush hour. They desperately need infrastructure investment, particularly in public transport. So can he tell the House when he last met with our city region mayors in the north of England and what his plans are for fiscal reform that will help them invest in public transport infrastructure?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my entire team meet with the regional mayors all the time, and we will do, of course, in the run-up to the SRM budget. But with regard to intra-city transportation, I agree with the Honourable Lady, that is important. Unlocking the economic potential of our cities is important to driving our economic recovery, which is why, in the first budget I did last year, we announced £4.2 billion for intra-city transport settlements for our largest several cities outside of London, so they enjoy the same long-term funding that London does and can invest in exactly the types of schemes that she describes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An investment infrastructure that doesn't get to the South Wales railway service, Mr. Speaker. DfT ministers keep announcing increased services along the main line in South Wales, which includes Pencoed and Melbourne constituency, but no increased investment in stations, level crossings, or indeed it's just in the track. When is the Chancellor going to get a grip and start investing in much-needed railway infrastructures in South Wales?
Chancellor. Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure I entirely recognise the aggregate picture the honourable gentleman presents, because rail investment over the course of this Parliament is at record levels under CP5 and then CP6, to give the technical terms. I'm very happy to take away the specific schemes, which he'll understand are a matter for the Welsh Government, but I'm happy to facilitate with the Department for Transportation as required.
Stephen Hammond.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend my right honourable friend for his commitment to infrastructure and particularly welcome the British Infrastructure Bank. But can I ask him to consider introducing an infrastructure bond so that long-term pension funds could invest in the future of this country as well?
Well,
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, Sorry. Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right, and he's previously highlighted the importance of unlocking pension fund capital to invest in long-term assets like infrastructure in the UK. He will know the Prime Minister and I wrote to pension funds just recently discussing this, and my honourable friend, the Economic Secretary, is actively working on creating what's called a long-term asset fund, which will be a new vehicle to unlock exactly the investment he wants into exactly the type of infrastructure that this country needs.
Ben Lake.
Number 12, sir.
Chancellor.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I should like to answer this question together with question numbers 16, 18 and 21. The government has always been clear that the £20 increase to universal credit was a temporary measure, much like furlough and our other interventions, to support this country through the acute phases of this crisis. But, Mr. Speaker, we are not done supporting those who need our help. This government will always be on their side, and that is why we have created our plan for jobs. Because on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we know the best way to help people is to give them the skills and the opportunities they need to find high-quality work, and that is what the plan for jobs is delivering.
Ben Lake.
Speaker, the ending of the uplift will of course mean £286 million less for families in Wales and risk plunging 275,000 families into poverty. Now, figures from the Bevan Foundation suggest that families in Ceredigion stand to lose £5.7 million in support. But what assessment has the Chancellor made of the economic impact of ending the £20 a week uplift for communities in Wales?
Chancellor. Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman talks about those in poverty. The statistics most recently published show that 200,000 fewer people are living in absolute poverty in the United Kingdom than when this government came into office. And with regard to the economic impacts, I think all colleagues on this House can see the strength in our labour market, the need for businesses to find people, and the fact that this government is giving them the skills they need to get those jobs. That's the right strategy to help people, and that's the economic strategy that this government is pursuing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst the Chancellor was pondering the colour of the tiles for his new swimming pool and the size of his new tennis court this summer for his country mansion, back in the real world, 20% of my constituency in Liverpool West Derby are facing a £20 a week cut to universal credit and facing sleepless nights about how they will survive. Can the Chancellor tell me what impact assessment the government have made on the impact of the cut, and how many of the 12,530 people in Liverpool West Derby do they estimate will be forced into poverty?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't accept that people will be forced into poverty, because we know, and all the evidence and history tells us, the best way to take people out of poverty is to find them high-quality work. And we are creating jobs at a rapid rate. 8 months of continuous growth in employment, Mr. Speaker, supported by this government. Traineeships, sector-based work academies, apprenticeships, Kickstart, you name it, we are delivering it to help those people in Liverpool get the skills and the jobs they need to help support their families.
Timms.
Mr. Speaker, 40% of the people who claim universal credit are already in work. Does the Chancellor understand that they will be very hard hit by this cut, which is the biggest overnight benefit cut in our history?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, Of course there are people already in work who are on universal credit, but our plan for jobs helps them too. Yes. We increased the national living wage this year by an inflation-busting amount, £350 a year to help those families. We talked earlier about the lifetime skills guarantee, about apprenticeships, about skills boot camps. Those are all ways that this government is supporting people, all, by the way, Mr. Speaker, worth thousands of pounds of support, each one of those initiatives. But those people will benefit from those increased skills, benefit from guaranteed new job interviews or higher wages at the end of it. That's the right strategy to help those people in work.
Alex Davis-Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, the charity Action for Children highlighted that a street cleaner with 2 children in private rented accommodation is already on average £729 worse off as a result of Conservative cuts since 2010. But this will soar to over £1,700 as a result of the Chancellor's planned cut to universal credit. So I ask the Chancellor, how exactly are families meant to manage?
Well, again, Mr. Speaker, what we know is that children growing up in workless households are 5 times more likely to be in poverty than those whose parents work, which is why we are supporting their parents to get in work, which is why almost 800,000 fewer children are living in workless households than when this government first came into office. And, Mr. Speaker, that is the right way to support those families. Of course, there are other bits of our welfare system that we have maintained the generosity of, but when it comes to universal credit or employment, on this side of the House, we will support their parents into work and, crucially, with their childcare costs. Mr. Speaker, we forget 85% of people's childcare costs on universal credit are covered to support their parents into work, which we know will make a difference to those children.
Stephen Timms.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the year ago, the government launched its plan for jobs, a comprehensive and ambitious plan to help people back into work, to earn more and to gain the skills they need to succeed in the jobs of tomorrow. The latest data shows that our GDP, our economy is recovering quickly, unemployment is falling, jobs are being created, and indeed, household incomes have been protected. All of that tells me, Mr. Speaker, that this government's plan for jobs is working.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Cutting universal credit by £20 a week will hit working families very hard. It'll leave support for unemployed families at the lowest real terms level for over 30 years. It'll undermine the recovery, scupper the prospects for levelling up. Does the Chancellor of the Exchequer understand why every single former Work and Pension Secretary since 2010 has opposed his cut?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman talks about economic recovery. We are forecast this year to grow faster than any other country in the G7. The recovery is underway, Mr. Speaker. Jobs are being created. People are getting into work. Wages are rising. That is the right strategy for us to pursue, Mr. Speaker. Our plan is working and we will stick to it.
Mr. Speaker, will the Chancellor provide an update on the follow-up to the discussions we've had on maintained nursery schools, and will he urgently bring forward a long-term funding settlement for these brilliant schools?
Yeah, Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight this issue, which I know is of particular importance to her and her constituency. I can assure her that I've spoken to my team about it, and as part of the spending review, we'll further those discussions with DFE, and I look forward to the Chief Secretary and her and I talking about this issue again.
Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor's plans to increase national insurance will hit workers and businesses hard at the worst possible time. The British Chamber of Commerce describe it as a drag anchor on jobs growth. The Federation of Small Businesses state that if this hike happens, fewer jobs will be created. And the TUC say that it is wrong to hit young and low-paid workers while leaving the wealthy untouched. We agree. Mr. Speaker, could the Chancellor of the Exchequer therefore explain why he is choosing a tax on jobs rather than on other forms of income?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to see the Labour Party finally focus on the importance of jobs in this House. And we also agree it's important to support companies to hire people, which is why, Mr. Speaker, there is no national insurance payable on those employing people under the age of 21, no national insurance payable on those most apprentices up to the age of 25, nor on people who are going to be employed in new free ports. And because of the steps that these Conservative governments before and ours have made to the employment allowance, 40% of all small businesses pay no employers' national insurance at all.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. You can't have it both ways. Either national insurance being cut benefits jobs or it doesn't. The Chancellor told voters at the election, and I quote, "Our plan is to cut taxes for the lowest paid through cutting national insurance." That promise is now in flames. The Chancellor isn't cutting national insurance, he is putting it up. It cannot be right that nurses and builders are set to pay hundreds of pounds more each year in national insurance, yet those getting their incomes from a large portfolio of shares, stocks and property will pay not a penny more. Labour cannot and will not support this Tory government's manifesto-breaking, economically damaging and unfair tax on jobs. So let me ask the Chancellor again. Why won't this government fund health and social care in a way that is fair for families and for businesses?
Chancellor. Mr Speaker, I'll be brief. When the Honourable Lady was appointed Shadow Chancellor, she said, and she went out of her way to say, that any policies that the Labour Party put forward under her watch would be, and I quote, fully costed, and we will explain how they are paid for. Mr Speaker, we've heard about uplifts to welfare, we've heard about more money for public sector pay, we've heard about opposing every difficult and responsible decision that this government has made. We have not heard once, Mr Speaker, how the Labour Party would pay for anything, and we know what happened last time around when they did that.
Dr. Luke Evans. Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Levelling Up Fund is about improving a region. Here in Bosworth, we're putting forward the Twycross Zoo for their National Centre of Conservation and Education. It'll be a world-leading scientific education and conservation centre, driving tourism and the local economy. It's backed by the Borough Council, the County Council, the LEP and the Midlands Engine. Would the Chancellor like to come and visit it? And failing that, would he like to meet me to discuss how we can make this a symbol of the levelling up for the nation?
But I don't know about the Chancellor. I'm sure my children would love to come and visit the zoo. But I'd like to thank my honourable friend for putting forward a bid for the Levelling Up Fund. As he will know, bids are currently subject to competitive assessment against objective criteria. But I think more generally, I think the whole House will welcome that zoos are once again fully open to the public this summer, and they do provide a wide range of valuable benefits.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The North Sea oil and gas bounty from the North Sea saw Scottish communities other than in Shetland fail to benefit from the bounty landing on their shores. Now that North Sea is having the offshore wind